patient.
The discussion, the conversation here has been very interesting, and I'm going to call on Senator Ossoff, and then I have a couple of follow-up questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your testimony. Just getting down to the fundamentals, Mr. Smith, if we're going to move forward with a legislative framework, a regulatory framework, we have to define clearly in legislative text precisely what it is that we're regulating. What is the scope of regulated activities, technologies, and products? So how should we consider that question? And how do we define the scope of technologies, the scope of services, the scope of products that should be subject to a regime of regulation that is focused on artificial intelligence?
I think there's 3 layers of technology on which we need to focus in defining the scope of legislation and regulation. First is the area that has been the central focus of 2023 in the executive branch and here on Capitol Hill. It's these so-called frontier or foundation models that are the most powerful, say for something like generative AI. In addition, there are the applications that use AI, or as Senators Blumenthal and Hawley have said, the deployers of AI. If there is an application that calls on that model in what we consider to be a high-risk scenario, meaning it could make a decision that would have an impact on, say, the privacy rights, the civil liberties, the rights of children or needs of children, then I think we need to think hard and have law and regulation that is effective to protect Americans. And then the third layer is the data center infrastructure, where these models and where these applications are actually deployed. And we should ensure that those data centers are secure, that there are cybersecurity requirements that the companies, including ours, need to meet. We should ensure that there are safety systems at 1, 2, or all 3 levels if there is an AI system that is going to automate and control, say, something like critical infrastructure such as the electrical grid. So those are the areas where we would say start there with some clear thinking and a lot of effort to learn and apply the details, but focus there.
As more and more models are trained and developed to higher levels of power and capability, there will be a proliferation. There may be a proliferation of models, perhaps not the frontier models, perhaps not those at the bleeding edge that use the most compute of all, powerful enough to have serious implications. So is the question which models are the most powerful in a moment in time, or is there a threshold of capability or power that should define the scope of regulated technology?
I think you've just posed one of the critical questions that, frankly, a lot of people inside the tech sector and across the government and in academia are really working to answer. And I think the technology is evolving and the conversation needs to evolve with it. Let's just posit this. There's something like GPT-4 from OpenAI. Let's just posit it can do 10,000 things really well. It's expensive to create, and it's relatively easy to regulate in the scheme of things because there's 1 or 2 or 10. But now let's go to where you're going, which I think is right. What does the future bring in terms of proliferation? Imagine that there's an academic at Professor Hartzog's university who says, I want to create an open source model. It's not going to do 10,000 things well, but it's going to do 4 things well. It won't require as many NVIDIA GPUs. It won't require as much data. But let's imagine that it could be used to create the next virus that could spread around the planet. Then you'd say, well, we really need to ensure that there's safety architecture and controls around that as well. And that's the conundrum. That's why this is a hard problem to solve. It's why we're trying to build safety architecture in our data centers so that open source models can, say, run in them and still be used in ways that will prohibit that kind of harm from taking place. But as you think about a licensing regime, this is one of the hard questions. Who needs a license? You don't want it to be so hard that only a small number of big companies can get it. But then you also need to make sure that you're not requiring people to get it when they really we would say don't need a license for what they're doing. And the beauty of the framework, in my view, is it starts to frame the issue. It starts to define the
Let
question.
me ask this
and that
question.
will work on
Is it a license to train a model to a certain level of capability? Is it a license to sell or license access to that model? Or is it a license to purchase or deploy that model? Who is the licensed entity?
That's another question that is key and may have different answers in different scenarios, but mostly I would say it should be a license to deploy. That, I think that there may well be obligations to disclose to, say, an independent authority when a training run begins, depending on what the goal, when the training run ends, so that an oversight body can follow it, just the way, say, might happen when a company's building a new commercial airplane. And then what's emerging, the good news is there's emerging a foundation of, call it, best practices for then how the model should be trained, what kind of testing there should be, what harms should be addressed. That's a big topic that needs discussion.
When you say, forgive me, Mr. Smith, when you say a license to deploy, do you mean, for example, if a Microsoft Office product wishes to use GPT model for some user-serving purpose within your suite, you would need a license to deploy GPT in that way? Or do you mean that GPT would require a license to offer to Microsoft? And putting aside whether or not this is a plausible commercial scenario, the question is, what's the structure of the licensing arrangement?
In this case, it's more the latter. Imagine, think about it like Boeing. Boeing builds a new plane. Before it can sell it to United Airlines and United Airlines can start to fly it, the FAA is going to certify that it's safe. Now imagine we're at, call it GPT-12, whatever you want to name it. Before that gets released for use, I think you can imagine a licensing regime that would say that it needs to be licensed after it's been, in effect, certified as safe. And then you have to ask yourself, well, how do you make that work so that we don't have the government slow everything down? And what I would say is you bring together three things. First, you need industry standards so that you have a common foundation and well-understood way as to how training should take place. Second, you need national regulation. And third, if we're going to have a global economy, at least in the countries where we want these things to work, you probably need a level of international coordination. And I'd say look at the world of civil aviation. That's fundamentally how it has worked since the 1940s. Let's try to learn from it and see how we might apply something like that or other models here.
Mr. Daly, how would you respond to the question in a field where the technical capabilities are accelerating at a rapid rate, future rate unknown, where and according to what standard or metric or definition of power do we draw the line for what requires a license for deployment and what can be freely deployed without oversight by the government?
I think it's a tough question because I think you have to balance two important considerations. The first is, the risks presented by a model of whatever power, and on the other side is the fact that we would like to ensure that the U.S. stays ahead in this field, and to do that we want to make sure that individual academics and entrepreneurs with a good idea can move forward and innovate and deploy models without huge barriers.
So it's the capability of the model, it's the risk presented by its deployment without oversight. Is that because the thing is, we're going to have to write legislation, and the legislation is going to have to, in words, define the scope of regulated products, and so we're going to have to bound that which is subject to a licensing arrangement or wherever we land, and that which is not. So
I think it is
what is the and so how do you,
And it's dependent on the application, because if you have a model which is, basically determining a medical procedure, there's a high risk with that, depending on the patient outcome. If you have another model which is, controlling the temperature in your building, if it gets a little bit wrong, you may be, consume a little bit too much power, or maybe, you're not as comfortable as you would be, but it's not a life-threatening situation. So I think you need to regulate the things that have high consequences if the model goes awry.
And I'm on the chairman's borrowed time, so just tap the gavel when you want me to stop.
You had to wait.
That's true.
So we'll give you a couple
Okay, good.
extra minutes.
Okay, Professor, and I'd be curious to hear from others as concisely with respect for the chairman's follow-ups. How does any of this work without international law? I mean, isn't it correct that a model, potentially a very powerful and dangerous model, for example, whose purpose is to unlock CBRN or mass destructive virological capabilities to a relatively unsophisticated actor, once trained, it's relatively lightweight to transport, and without an international legal system, and B, a level of surveillance that seems inconceivable into the flow of data across the internet, how can that be controlled and policed?
It's a great question, Senator, and with respect to being efficient in my answer, I'll simply say that there are going to be limits. Even assuming that we do need international cooperation, which I would agree with you, I mean, we've already started thinking about ways in which, for example, within the EU, which has already deployed some significant AI regulation, we might design frameworks that are compatible with that require some sort of interaction. But ultimately, what I worry about is actually deploying a level of surveillance that we've never before seen in an attempt to perfectly capture the entire chain of AI, and that's simply not possible. And
I share that concern about privacy, which is in part why I raised the point. I mean, how can we know what folks are loading a lightweight model once trained onto perhaps a device that's not even online anymore?
Right. I mean, there are limits, I think, to what we'll ever be able to know.
Either of you want to take a stab before I get gavelled out here?
I would just say you're right. There's going to need to be a need for international coordination. I think it's more likely to come from like-minded governments than perhaps global governance, at least in the initial years. I do think there's a lot we can learn. We were talking with Senator Blackburn about the SWIFT system for financial transactions. And somehow we've managed globally, and especially in the United States, for 30 years to have know your customer requirements, obligations for banks. Money has moved around the world. Nothing is perfect. I mean, that's why we have laws. But it's worked to do a lot of good to protect against, say, terrorist or criminal uses of money that would cause concern.
Well, I think you're right in that these models are very portable. You could put the parameters of most models, even the very large ones, on a large USB drive and carry it with you somewhere. You could also train them in a data center anywhere in the world. So I think it's really the use of the model and the deployment that you can effectively regulate. It's going to be hard to regulate the creation of it because if people can't create them here, they'll create them somewhere else. And I think we have to be very careful if we want the U.S. to stay ahead, that we want the best people creating these models here in the U.S. and not to go somewhere else where the regulatory climate has driven them.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.